Okay, I'm just making this video in the hopes that James Lindsay sees it. But James Lindsay, one of the things that I think might be kind of cool in a way, I know it's sort of taboo in respected intellectual circles or whatever, but you know, works of art tend to excite people and drive motivations and stuff like that. And I get that there's a certain right-wing vision of the left as being entirely soy boy based on fiction and completely out of touch with reality, but a little bit of fiction to spice up the imagination and so on does have value at times. It can inspire you in that sort of C.S. Lewis way of you don't have to tell little boys dragons exist. You need to tell them heroic knights exist that can slay the dragon. Anyways, the reason I'm making this video is because I would be interested in you checking out Warhammer 40,000. And there's a valid reason for this, which is it's one of those intellectual properties or stories or whatever that is heavily reactionary coded in the proper reactionary sense. And also check out Feral Historian and look for Warhammer 40k themed things from him, basically. And there's a recent one done about a month ago or two now on the sort of grind fest of history and how everyone's feeling the same way and how the leftist view the right wing as the imperium of man, fascism, and the right wing looks at the left as the chaos demons. And he just acknowledges both exist simultaneously, and then he moves on to more like what's everyone's feeling kind of things. And yeah. So if you were to look up Warhammer 40,000 and one of the ways to do it is look up the personalities and traits of the Primarchs, Primarchs, I guess. Primarch is singular. And the God Emperor of Mankind, and Malcador the Sigillite, or Sigillite, like sigil. Malcador. And this is the kind of thing that motivates people to some extent. Maybe not the modern incarnations of the story entirely, the last, 5 years maybe, but, the previous incarnations really motivated people, and it's getting really popular as Warhammer 40,000 is getting really popular because it speaks on a fundamental level as fiction to a lot of our current stuff, as Feral Historian points out. Let's see. I'm currently looking up the Feral Historian video in question. It's called Warhammer 40,000: Cultural Relevance. And basically there's a couple names I want to throw out there. There's Vulcan with a K instead of a C. There's Robute Guilliman, or Guilliman, like Gilly almost, except it's almost like pronounced Gilly, like ghillie suit, which is like a sniper thing with lots of camouflage attached. But it's spelled Guilliman. And Robute is basically robot with a U after the second O and an E at the end. And then there's Sanguinius. And then there's Ferris, which is 2 R's. Manus, which is 1 N. MANUS. There's the Lion. I can't remember his name. But he's the Primarch of the Dark Angels. There's Leman Russ, which is like Le Man in French, Russ, like Russ. And each of these guys, and then there's Rogel Dorn, which is basically royal with a G instead of a Y, and Dorn. You know, and then look at Conrad Kurz with a Z instead of an S, where otherwise it's pronounced Conrad Kurz. So it's Conrad Kurz, based on Kurtz, I think from Heart of Darkness or something. I think there's a relationship there on some level. And then there's Horace Lupercal, and then there's Perturabo. There's Fulgrim, Fulgrim. Just look up the Primarchs, basically. You know what I mean? Like, look up the 18 people and their philosophies, and where people from about 1995 or 2000 determined people with these kinds of traits would end up as, and so on. It's a very WWF, WWE sort of wrestling, pro wrestling sort of machismo environment, storytelling-wise. But there's 9 villainous Primarchs and 9 heroic loyalist Primarchs. And part of the reason for the Grim Dark is that these demigod superhumans aren't leading humanity like they were in the past, and so on. But each of the 9 is a section, is an aspect to the one God Emperor that created all 22 lost that are completely unknown about, and 18, 9 good, 9 bad ones that exist currently, and so on. And you get like interesting little phenomena like the Alpha Legion with Omegon and Alpharius as like a twin Primarch thing. So I guess there's 21 Primarchs technically, or 19 left over, the 2 that disappeared notwithstanding. And their philosophy, for instance, was like, we're covert ops, and we're so covert we don't even know our own motivations, or something like that. It's like postmodernism as an entire doctrine of tactics or something. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of moral coding to the basic philosophies of these people. Like Conrad Kurz is a counterpart to Vulcan, and Vulcan is black person coded, space black person in Star Wars basically, or something like. He's got charcoal skin, very black, red eyes or something. But he's like just tanned that well, basically, or tanned that much, basically. But he's a very the well-being of sentient beings, or at least humanity, as opposed to the aliens, coded, and he's very upset with aliens for manipulating the deaths of millions of people and so on. Which sounds kind of like a shout-out at Israel for a second, versus the West or something like that. If you consider all the rest of the world to be the aliens from 40K or something. And then he contrasts him, who cares about people enough to actually sacrifice his own life for the well-being of a couple people, and to his dying breath, he continues to sacrifice himself and so on, and perseveres through hardship with impossible odds and so on for the sake of continuing people's existence. With Conrad Kurz, who slaughters and skins children alive to set an example of what happens to you if you fall out of line in the slightest way for his utopia in to solve a crime-ridden society. So you find some real philosophical differences between these Primarchs. And I would be interested in knowing sort of how you would balance these different strengths and weaknesses of each of these 9 good and 9 bad ones and so on, and whether or not you think it's valid, basically. Because it's sort of interesting, because they all represent slightly different philosophies, even though they're all basically demigods of a true god, or a walking god, basically. And he's kind of a super King Arthur mythos kind of guy. He's kind of a pastiche of Jesus Christ. Vulcan is as well with the resurrection thing, and the long suffering for the sake of humanity and so on. The Melkador guy is sort of the Merlin figure in a sense, although the God Emperor is Arthur plus Merlin, and Melkador is just Merlin, basically. So you got like a shadow side to the shadowy wizard, to the noble god king, and so on. But the nine primarchs, being evil, that are his sons, speak to his dark side on top of Malkador, and so on. And I would just be interested in seeing what your reactions are to these things in a sense, because it's all reactionary based, but at the same time, there's some truly noble and heroic qualities. And I would suggest if you wanted the most humane Primarchs available, there's Robute Guilliman, Vulcan, and Sanguinius. And a lot of these guys are killed off in the story and stuff like that. But those three, well, they speak to me personally, and it's one of those things where it's like they're idealized expressions of a way of life and philosophy, sort of, within a realm that is naturally at war all the time, or almost everywhere all the time, and the quest for bringing order and justice and peace. And at least with the good leaders, the strong leaders, they managed to do a little bit of liberty, and there's a little plot line about how the God Emperor was planning to make a galactic republic, and then it turned into a sort of well, basically, he was crusading to make a galactic republic that is very atheist, and he wasn't afraid to kill off entire planets that resisted their conquest to reunite all of humanity. And then it descended into, you just have to be able to send like a certain number of troops or a certain number of resources to the war effort to keep our survival going, and we'll just let you govern yourselves mostly unless you call for help or you stop giving us the tax, basically. And it's technically a feudal, god-worshipping existence, except their god king became a bit of a corpse, or like a comatose patient. And basically it's the God Emperor of mankind. He started off as like a Conan the Barbarian with magic and psychic powers and future prediction telling and physique, pure peak physique, and then he ended up as like a comatose Auschwitz prisoner or something like that, basically, who just maintains the ability for, like, he's basically a glorified spotlight, or what's it called, a lighthouse at this point for humanity, and a beacon for hope and prayers and stuff like that. And occasionally he answers them and so on, but he doesn't have any direct control of the galaxy, because he's not actually like awake. And Melkador burns himself up basically to a crisp, maintaining the lighthouse effect when the God Emperor goes to personally fight his rebellious son, who's the incarnation of Satan, basically. So like, there's some heavy stuff in it in a way, and it's kind of like WWF wrestling with heels, and what's the good guy version of that called? I'd be interested in seeing what your vision of the various Primarchs actually is for the different political classes, because one of the things that was sort of a thing that was done and I tried to make it happen, and it did happen, but I don't know if I had anything to do with making it happen, is there's 4 Chaos Gods, and Slanesh is basically LGBT. Postmodernism is Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, and Slanesh is the Prince of Pleasure. And Nurgle is the god of disease. So I guess we got that COVID thing going, or the pharmaceutical industry keeping people sick or something like that in order to profit off of selling them treatments for something they could cure by eating well or something. And Islam is basically corn. And there's also something called the Tao in it, which are Tau, and they're very sort of Chinese focused in a sense, and Japanese mech anime sort of themed in their actual fighting warrior technology suits, art, vehicles stuff, but they're kind of Chinese in organization societally. Anyways, those are the areas of focus I would suggest if you're interested at all in this kind of thing. I'm literally just making this video to catch your interest, hopefully, or something like that. But I will be interested in knowing which Primarchs, as expressions of fundamental human philosophical underpinnings, do you think best describes the various political labels you've used so far? So to basically use a fictional example to strip it of its real world connotations for a second to give a more purified vision of where you stand on these things. Because for me, the reactionaries tend to be very Robute Guilliman and sort of the Lion or something. And I base that on and Vulcan as well, actually. And I base that on Graf von Galen, who is a reactionary in World War II in Nazi Germany. And if you look him up and see what he did, there's no way you can possibly say that a proper reactionary is pro-Hitler at all. And part of the reason why I'm making this video is to point out that there's reactionary stuff, and it's not the same as fascism. And one of the things about Warhammer 40k that makes it reactionary is that it basically says progress is a myth. In fact, I think at one point, one of its taglines was, forget the promise of technological progress and humanitarian society. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only war and slaughter to the laughter of thirsting gods. So it's a very dark setting in a way. But it's lightened up a little bit lately, and the Primarchs is kind of what keeps it lighter now, in a sense. One of the common complaints is that it's now Hope Hammer as opposed to Grim Dark. And the old fans kind of are rebelling against the new fans and so on a little bit. And some of the Progressive Games Workshop, the company that owns the product, and the lore company, is doing is they're adding certain leftist things, like, for instance, the super duper Space Marines, the Custodes, which are basically like the peak other than Primarch and God Emperor, were always male at one point, and then they got introduced as being able to be female, and that was against a lot of people's wishes. And the reason they did it is because technically they're not Space Marines, and one of the things is the left was pushing for female Space Marines, And it's like, the right was like, it doesn't make any sense that we would sacrifice women for warfare, and they're weaker typically, and so on. You know, they, they're less resilient in the face of physical danger, and so on. Typically speaking. So yeah, yeah. It's a very reactionary world, Warhammer 40,000. Um, but use the Primarchs as ways of looking at certain philosophical underpinnings, and see look to if the Primarchs disposition would naturally lead towards that kind of outcome, and so on, an alignment on the good and evil chart, and also B, which 2 to 3 Primarchs do you think would represent each of the labels: communist, fascist, liberal, and reactionary? Because I differentiate all four, basically. I think all four are valid. I think fascism is. I think liberalism is probably center, center right, center left. I think fascism is kind of center right, center left, center as well. So there's a little overlap. But I think communism is left and reactionaryism is right. And I would like to see your Warhammerified view of which characters represent which of those four, to the tune of 2 to 3 Primarchs at most for each one. And they can be loyalist or good, and they can be chaos or evil. Doesn't really matter to me. But I'd be interested in seeing something purified in focus conceptually to describe the reality of the real political positions, and sort of allowing for some overlap between them, basically, which is why I mentioned the different Primarchs and so on. Um, yeah, yeah. It might be a way to engage people a little better, and maybe they'll razz on you because they don't like your takes or something like that. But it might be a way to connect with the reactionaries a little bit. And like, I know some of them might like attack you because they'll attack you anyways about like, oh, now he's getting into children's fiction. But like, a lot of the reactionaries actually do feel like there's some degree of actual philosophical underpinning behind the characters on some level when they actually pay attention. And like, the general gist of Warhammer 40,000 is a very reactionary thing, and a lot of reactionaries actually do like Warhammer 40,000. So I realize they might say like, "How do you do, fellow Warhammer enthusiasts?" Like the "How do you do, fellow kids" thing with Steve Buscemi with a skateboard or something. When he's an adult, and like they might kind of get at you on that, but it might be a way to actually connect with them.